wanted to start this episode of Content Minded with something that I discovered recently. And this show will be mostly about musics. I talk a little bit about the whole, again, the continuous gender war, which I, say I should ignore, and I really am trying to go to great lengths to ignore. But ultimately, I do make a better point about how media ecology shapes our unconscious mind. And I talk in this episode. I talk a lot about music. In the paywalled version, I'll talk about. There was this great article I read about called "The Other Third Worldism" by a great Substacker from France. He follows me. His name is Fleur in Verse, and I highly recommend. I will link below. And he's maybe I have him on the show one day, but I wanted to talk about something in the beginning that I find significant. That has to do with Buddhist eschatology. But I find it significant because recently I've been clearing out a lot of space in the storage room that we have in my house, because I want to make like a little exercise room. I'm gonna have like a pulley machine I'm gonna buy, and of course my barbell, and all my weights. Eventually I have to buy plates because the barbell can. It's more efficient to have, I guess, 45s and 25s than just stacking like 10s. I think five plates on each end to make 100 pounds is sort of a bit ridiculous. But so I'm slowly in the process of, with my parents, moving a lot of things and a lot of stuff. Like, it's unfortunate that when you build up so much clutter, you have like old ratty toys and stuff, and they have stuff from the 70s and 80s that are like kind of falling apart, and you can't really save it. But the stuff that you do save, like a lot of my notes from school, a lot of the emails that I save from people that, because I'll let you Zoomers in on a secret. We used to trade emails all the time. I believe you need an email to discover people on MSN Messenger. So I have a lot of that stuff. And what I discovered was, I believe this may have been printed out back in the day by my uncle, former uncle, because he was uncle by marriage, but him and my aunt have been divorced for a number of years now. And he was a practicing Buddhist, and he was I believe, I forget the exact martial art where he was an instructor. He was a third degree black belt in a form of jujitsu, and I believe also goju-ryu. I forget. But anyways, it ended badly, but I found this while I was cribbing through my notes. I was going through what I was throwing out. And I think it's significant to where you sort of arrive at a point in life where I've been studying a lot of this material for a long time. And when you're a kid, you don't really have an awareness of things. And this was probably printed off on some like Usenet forum or some website. This is from, I believe, 2001. Where is it from? So this is from the Society for Ethical Culture, 2 West 64th Street, off Central Park West in Manhattan. They're talking about a meeting they want to attend in December 1st, 2001. Society for Ethical Culture, for commemoration of the 750th anniversary of the establishment of true Buddhism, which will be held at the Society for Ethical Culture, December 1st, 2001. And this is called the Latter Day of the Law, which, if people know, is sort of like a weird form of Buddhist eschatology, to where, what is it? I believe, again, it's been a while since I've heard of the term, but I believe it's like the time period in which the Buddha will no longer, so many centuries away from the reincarnation of the Buddha, of Gautama Buddha, or not Gautama Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha. So this has a big history and different interpretations of Buddhism. So this comes from the Nichiren Daishonin, who established what he considered to be the true teachings of Buddhism. The latter day of the law refers to the age when the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha lose their power to lead people to enlightenment. It was generally regarded to mean the period starting 2,000 years after the Buddha's passing. In Japan, it was believed that the age began in the year 1052, and some say that it will last for about 10,000 years, the fifth of 500-year periods. I think even the Bible had a lot of that numerology type of stuff. And at my side by 10,000, sort of, a lot of numbers keep ringing back and forth in the Bible. And here it says it also correlates to the 3 ages of the 3 periods of the Buddha. In the latter day of the law, people are tainted by their 3 poisons of greed, anger, and foolishness, and lose their aspiration for enlightenment. And this comes from the Nichiren Buddhist Library. The 3 ages of Buddha. Latter day of the law is to begin in 2,000 years after the Shakyamuni Buddha's passing. The 3 consecutive periods of stage into which the time follows the Buddha's death is divided. And, there's a lot of biographical information of different Buddhists, but it basically is sort of a weird form of Buddhist eschatology, or rather cyclical Buddhist eschatology, the way that you have in Hinduism, the particular sort that inspired thinkers such as Oswald Spengler. And there's a lot of meaning behind what this will happen. So spoken ill of and cursed, would be wounded by swords and staves and pelted with stones and tiles, and again banished. The Nichiren Shoshu school of Buddhism believes that Nichiren Daishonin is a votary of the Lotus Sutra and the latter day of the Dharma. So yeah, the Lotus Sutra was quite popular in Japan and in China. Again and again banished. So again, this is sort of like the time in which there will be no longer a yearning for enlightenment, a yearning for to stepping, the time in which people will no longer wish to step off the wheel of samsara. The age of conflict, when, quote, quarrels and disputes will arise among the adherents to my teaching, the pure Dharma become obscure and lost. So that's like your basic summary. So this is the letter I wanted to read that teaches, and then, but this is why. This is why, again, in my millennial nostalgia compels me to read this letter, if you know what I mean. Okay, the latter day of the law. And who knows who this was written by? This is basically written by a committee. So, exactly 2 months ago to the day, America experienced attacks of terrorism never before witnessed in this country's history. You know exactly. December 1st, 2001, you know what happened, right? How are we to perceive these events from the perspective of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism? As you all know, some 3,000 years ago, Shakyamuni Buddha handed down 80,000 teachings, which were to help mankind both during his lifetime and for the next 2,000 years after his passing, to attain an enlightened life condition of serenity and joy. Even so, the Buddha predicted that following the 2,000 years of the former and middle days of his Buddhism, during the evil age of the latter day of the law, his teachings would lose their effectiveness to heal the spiritual ills of the world. I have often used the metaphor of medicine whose expiration date had passed to explain this phenomenon. But it is important that you know that Shakyamuni's teaching did not just happen to grow weak or lose their inherent truth. The Buddha will never lied. Rather, by the time we entered the latter day of the law, or we have entered the latter day of the law, the world was to become so polluted by the 5 impurities of the age, man's desires, the people inhabiting this planet, men's thoughts, and life itself, that the medicine of Shakyamuni's teachings were no longer strong enough to fight off the sickness that plagued the world. A passage from the Daishonin's reply to Takahashi Naiudo states, quote, though the world of these sutras still remain, the words of these sutras still remain, or the world even, they will no longer serve as medicine for the illnesses of living beings. The illnesses will be too grave and the medicines too ineffective. So with the coming of the latter day of the law, the world needed a stronger, more effective Buddhism. If it hoped to become well again, and by the way, there is forms of militant Buddhism throughout the world, but that of course gets buried in the sort of New Age hippyification of Buddhism in the West. This is much like our present need for stronger antibiotics and other medicines that combat the various new strains of bacteria and viruses that have begun to infect people's bodies. Shakyamuni predicted that during the defiled latter age, the true Buddha who could bestow the medicine that would heal man's ills would make his advent in the land to the northeast. So again, there is a lot of, I'll read the rest of the letter, but there's a lot of warring interpretations as to when the Buddha will come again, if there's a weird mistranslation that imports a lot of Christian sort of eschatology into the arrival of a new Buddha. There's a lot of effort and a lot of scholars debate, and a lot of mainstream scholars disagree with the whole axial age idea that Buddha, Gautama Buddha, and Christ arised within roughly the same period, give or take 1,000 years or so. But it's very interesting when you do look at this, that there is a vast perennial truth to the waning of things. But there is a difference in the sense that in Buddhism, in various forms of Buddhism, especially in Mahayana, there's teach that once you've arrived to there's a sutra about a raft or riverman that ventures into a body of water and goes to the other side of the shore. And once you go past the shore, you leave the boat behind. The boat is no longer useful. I guess if you're making a shelter or whatever. But in the sense that you leave the teaching behind when you no longer require the teaching after you achieved a state of enlightenment. Very different from Christianity. Christianity being a philosophy, a religion, a faith of death and immortality, a faith in which Christ teaches that through every iteration of the soul, through every time period, the truth remains factual, eternal, and will, from now to kingdom come, will have a form of lasting eschatological comportment. It will act in a certain way. And this truth is immortal. Whereas in Buddhism, eschatology is quite different. It is cyclical. The ages will repeat once again. There will be a reverberation of things, which is very different to the Eastern consciousness. And there's a lot of very interesting things about how the Japanese persecuted Christianity and why the religion was different or hostile. And there's a lot of online Christians they talk about. Wouldn't it be great if Japanese converted? I mean, yeah. The hope is that the whole world converts, but I think when it's sort of like when pagans have their own little rituals. It's like I'm not particularly offended unless they're like burning down churches. Like I know Varge was posting cool the other day about it, but for example, if you have like recently a lot of these Christians, they were making a big scoofia for they're making a big fuss. Sorry, I'm reverting to the Italian lingo. They're making a big scoofia over the Olympics having ceremonies about Mount Olympus. And I mean, I think it's, I again, like I have friends who are pagans and I don't, as long as we're copacetic, I know I'm not being a particularly good traditionalist Catholic, but I think the whole interfaith war on the E-right is besides the point. But I think there is a lot of valuable philosophic nuance, but it is very funny how there is that awareness of a cyclical nature of history, but also an awareness that there will be a sort of down period. There will be a sort of Kali Yuga type of existence that we have to go through that might last multiple thousands of years. Anyways, that Buddha was the Nichiren Daishonin, who was born almost 780 years ago in Japan. The medicine he offered is Nam Maho Renga Kayo, I am not pronouncing it right, the distillation actual source of all the Shakyamuni's teachings. Along with the greatest of medicines, the Daishonin also offered to the Japanese people of his day a warning contained in writing called the Rishi Ankoku Ran, which was supported by the Shakyamuni's teachings, and asserted that people who could revere Shakyamuni's true law would disappear from the face of the earth during the latter day of the law. What do they mean by disappearance? Will they go off into stepping into the next phase of enlightenment? Will they then transform? Not transform, but will they sort of subtly slip out of the wheel of samsara and their rebirth is then a moot point? What will happen to them? will they simply quietly disappear from our plane of existence during the latter day of the law period. As a result of this disappearance, the Daishonin predicted that the Buddhist heavenly deities who protected the land could not be sustained because no one was left to offer them favor of the true law. So again, this a lot of it comes from the older pagan or animist traditions that were present in these societies before the arrival and the conversion to Buddhism. But Buddhism still retains a lot of that sort of animistic practice of giving sacrifice and offerings and so forth. These heavenly deities would therefore be forced to abandon these lands and ascend into the heavens. Again, what did Christ say even? I shall not know you. Or I never knew you. I shall not know you. You know, you abandon the truth, and that, therefore the truth shall abandon you. Notice how that lesson in times of great calamity, in times of moral decay, there is that fundamental absence or abandonment onto the world of any heavenly deities, of even, you know, in the Christian context this is different, but that fundamental abandonment is still there, or rather the abandonment of a world that has fallen, to only then be sort of, to then be reestablished in a different period. Although Christianity is not as cyclical, there's some weirdo interpretations, but Christianity does not have that cyclical nature the way that, for example, Vedanta or even a lot of forms of Buddhism have. And some forms of Buddhism don't have the same awareness of periods. They say, well, whatever happens, happens, and whether there's the beginning of creation or the end of it, it doesn't really matter to the purview of someone who wishes to achieve liberation. They will be forced to abandon these lands and ascend to the heavens. Instead, devils and demons would fill the land. Again, very, that's like Pure Land Buddhism has a lot of influences, or rather, there's a lot of cross connections between a more, shall we say, Western interpretation of metaphysics. These instead, demons and deities would fill the land, which would then be assaulted by 7 types of disaster, including earthquakes, storms, typhoons, drought, famine, epidemics, civil wars, and foreign invasions. Very interesting. Foreign invasions, epidemics. Almost sounds like Revelation. Very interesting. I know that this society is writing this letter for a predominant, well, even in 2001, it's still a predominantly Christian society. But it's very interesting when you support it. In those days, Japan did not enjoy the affluence of modern times. On the contrary, during the Daishonin's lifetime, the country was under the military rule of the samurai class, which had the power and life and death over the rest of society. Civil war erupted, and Japan suffered 2 invasions by the Mongol Empire. Parents and children redacted each other. Nearly 50% of the Japanese population was wiped out due to starvation and smallpox. I didn't know that. I wonder if that is backed up. I think I heard that some scholars may disagree with the numbers, but that's neither here nor there. They did suffer a huge calamity either way. In the midst of such terror, and in the spirit of the risk of redacting, at Tatsunokuchi and exile to Iso and Sado, the Daishonin still dared to propagate true Buddhism. Now, although Shakyamuni Buddhism can no longer cure mankind's ills, so again, you abandon the teaching, unlike in Christianity or in a lot of pagan faiths in the West, where the teaching remains immortal, although there is some pagan traditions in which the teaching is called for a sort of reformation or a selective abandonment of given different time periods. But there is a sense in which these teachings are mortal, whereas here, it can no longer cure mankind's ills. And even though the Daishonin's Risho Ankuko Ran was specifically written for the Japanese people of his day, both Shakyamuni's predictions about the latter day of the law and the Daishonin's Risho remain valid today. Afghanistan and Pakistan were formerly Buddhist kingdoms. And here we go. Here is the ethnic tension part. In ancient India, the Buddhist objects of reverence included the 3 treasures, the law, the Buddha, and the priesthood, and the sutras. After the Buddha's passing, King Ashoka built 100 stupas, each one standing 100 feet tall and crowned with the heads of 4 lions that face the 4 directions. The numinous faces, the faces that, and they get this, of course, from the original Hindu, the sort of mixing of Hindu teachings in it. They can't divorce each other completely. There's sort of like the manifold faces of Shiva, for instance. But notice the 4 paths, the 4 directions of the lion going off into each direction, signifying the teaching going forth in each direction. Notice how the lion also is established in Christianity as well. But there were no statues of the Buddha. However, 300 years after the Buddha's passing, as his teaching spread from India into the regions that included Afghanistan and Pakistan, Buddhism was also influenced by the simultaneous diffusion of ancient Greek ideology. So again, the first sculptors of the Buddha were Greek. Some of the first. Which included the glorification of religious deities through sculpture, which was, again, a foreign ideal. That is something that is unique to the Western mind. That there is a full presence of the image, to quote the French sinologist Francois Julian. That is unique to Western culture. That then gets spread throughout many other cultures. Even in not as much as Magian civilization, as Spangler correctly noted about their sort of Anconism, their taboos against the faces of Muhammad, for instance, which included the glorification of religious deities through sculpture. And in these countries, not in India, the world first witnessed the sculpting and opening of the eyes of the statues of the Buddha as objects of worship for the first time. Hence the existence until just recently of 200-foot statues of the Buddha in the Afghan desert. Nevertheless, the former and middle days of Shakyamuni Buddhism drew to a close, so reverence for his teachings also faded in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as in many areas of Southeast Asia. The Buddhist deities departed from Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Buddha statues' eyes were closed, the lands were possessed by demons and devils, and the 7 disasters descended upon the former Buddhist kingdoms, which were invaded and are still ruled today by adherents of Islam. Whoa! Whoa! Red pill! Truth nuke! Here we go. Oh my god! They blew up the statues. This... And again, this... See, in 2001, even like, the Buddhists were down with the Gowat, the global war on terror. But there has been a militant form of Buddhism in these regions, in Tibet and India and elsewhere, that have fought off invasive Islamic influences. That's a reality. And I think that's, very, very interesting history to a lot of it. And, like, for example, like, there, even recently I saw these, like, these Islamists celebrating the anniversary of blowing up the statues in Afghanistan, and it's like, oh my god, it's just so much cool. But anyways, so it's funny, even like right after 9/11, they weren't afraid to like equate the the land will be inherited by demons, and and here we have another passage that I think is quite interesting, because I remember, was it Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell? I think they both got in trouble it was right after 9/11, where they blamed the ills of America on certain leftoid demographics, and they got into trouble for that. But here, this is kind of like, from what I can tell, the ethical movement and the Society for Ethical Culture, they're like a atheistic movement, but here they're invoking very stark language that comes off as like a biblical end times evangelism, where they say that in most recent times, Afghanistan has been invaded by the former Soviet Union. And since the end of the conflict, there has been constant civil war between the ruling Taliban in the south and insurgent forces in the north, meaning the Northern Alliance. And it's funny because the West sort of stopped paying attention to Afghanistan during the 90s, which they probably shouldn't, but who knows. And it's sort of like when the Soviet Union fell apart and when the Afghan war ended in, was it 89? And all those Russian soldiers came back addicted and mutilated and so forth. the Taliban reestablished their authority, and then they were crushed. A lot of Taliban fighters were crushed during Operation Tora Bora, which was the first salvo into the invasion of Afghanistan by America after 9/11 in response. Constant civil war between the ruling Taliban and the South, and that history is, of course, very fascinating to me. And the Syrian forces of the North, and of course the Northern Alliance, becomes a key, crucial ally to Afghanistan, to the American forces in Afghanistan. The nation often experienced earthquakes and extremes in weather, and drought now threatens the entire Afghan population. The biological toxin anthrax is the modern threat of pestilence. Well, wait about 25 to 30 years before you get a, clown vid. Meanwhile, the statues of the Buddha, which by this time have been reduced in stature to mere artifacts or works of art, are being destroyed out of religious zeal. By the way, most of the stupas built by King Ashoka have been destroyed. Very interesting. So, does this not come off like biblical end times eschatology, but like a Buddhist version of it? All of these events prove that we are indeed living in the age of Mappo, which is Mappo. Our current, which I believe is the third reigning era in that cyclical period, similar to the age of matter, the Kali Yuga. But there's key distinctions and differences, but it strikes similar to the Hindu cosmology. Our current tragedy should not be viewed as the personal evil of a single man or nation. It is not even a war between Islam and Buddhism, but true to Shakyamuni's predictions and the Dishonen's Rishu, Indian Buddhism has no more power to cleanse the pollution that stains the entire world. Which, again, very problematic language for nowadays. That, oh my God, you're seeing the modern world as evil, that it's filled with corruption and avarice and people that are abandoning the sacred law. Oh my God, that's terrible. That's incredibly, that's problematic. Buddhist deities are no longer fed by the flavor of the law, and the law meaning something akin to a sacred ethos that drives deeper into our present reality, the way that Mahat is in Egypt, for example. But I mean, I know there's key distinctions because Egyptian mythology is still very, it's polytheistic, but it's still very metaphysical as opposed to Buddhism, but it's something that drives deeper into the source, the wellspring from which all things flow. It's not just merely a juridical law, for instance. So the Buddhist deities are no longer fed by the flavor of the law. The law can only be circulated by the people that believe, by the people that are giving alms and offerings. The deities are sustained by the collective dharma of a civilization. So notice there's that reciprocity. And so the lowering of the law culminates in the vanishment or abandoning of the deities, of the dharma itself, in the age of unbelief, in the age of calamity. So it's very important. Fed with flavors of the law and have returned to the heavens, devils have taken their place and seem to be unstoppable. Very interesting. Is that not true? The only true option of the world at this time is the widespread adoption of the Dushanonen's three great secret laws. But for example, if any of us were to venture into Afghanistan at this time in order to teach the Dashonen's Buddhism, Islamic law would demand our immediate redaction. Yet America offers freedom of religion. Our opportunity is here, as if we Shokabuku Muslims in this country and convince them to chant Damoku, they could then return to their native lands, whether it be Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia, or Malaysia. Shakabuku, their fellow countrymen. So in order to chant the divine faith, so they're basically saying that you have to conform to the pre-existing Buddhist law of the land, which is pretty based actually. And then he's saying then you could return. So you will be, he's like, here in America, there's religious toleration, but you will be going back. So that's funny. But our efforts must not stop there. Nichiren Shoshu is not allowed in countries like India, China, or Korea either. So when we think about gathering for our general meeting on December 1st to commemorate the 750th anniversary of the establishment of true Buddhism, it is not enough to think about our practice as a hobby. So again, even their religious leaders are being put in a state of permanent exile by secular governments in these nations. Our general meeting... So there's a weird form of theocratic nationalism, I would say. Not that they would view it as a form of nationalism, because really this is truly a world, global phenomenon, but there is a weird form of theocratic action from a Buddhist perspective that you could interpret in this text. Our general meeting must mark a reaffirmation of our mission as disciples of the Nichiren Daishonin. Military, political, and economic sanctions are not the key to ending the fundamental strife that is now erupted in the world. Of course, they say this for OPSEC. We must deliver more deeply into the realm of shokobuku, and no matter what difficulties we may face personally, we must give up. I would like to invite you all to the commemoration anniversary establishment of the true Buddhism, which is to be held at the Society for Ethical Culture at 264th Street, 2 p.m. Saturday, December 1st, 2001. What I wouldn't give to go back in time to 2 p.m. on Saturday, December 1st, 2001. And of course, in Buddhism, shakobuku is their form of evangelism, in which the resistance of other persons is destroyed by force of argumentation. So not exactly the evangelism of other beliefs, certainly not of Islam, but concrete exercise of compassion and belief in Buddha nature, the act of highest respect for others while still evangelizing. And then, oh my God, there's a Reddit thread about this particular form of Buddhism called Sokogaki Whistleblowers. Sokogaki International, Shokobuku is said to be the fastest way of changing your karma, gain benefits, and gain more happiness. The truth is just a Japanese term for recruiting, the same as Jehovah's Witness who go to order with the Kingdom Hall publications. Recruiting is the best way to ruin your reputation and erode your social capital. Make no mistake about it, you won't find as much social capital in SGI. You will never find social capital of people who believe that they found the ultimate source of wish granting and happiness. Shokobuku is disrespectful to people because they're lording the supremacy of Nichiren Buddhism to the SGI over in all other religions. Shokobuku is a dead giveaway that you are in a cult, that you ought to be avoided like the plague, especially when you are tangibly in a worse state, the people you're trying to evangelize to. Shokobuku is not an act of compassion, it's an act of spiritual narcissism, because to engage in these practices is to say to other people that your spiritual insights are superior to theirs. Shokobuku and recruiting for MLMs and pyramid schemes have the same aftermath. You invest a lot and gain a little. Oh, wow, this is just typical bleeding heart Redditism. And of course, all these hate-filled and intolerant religions seek world conquest only produce... this is a comment. Only problem is nowadays they have to convince people to join. They can't just brutalize them into submission the way the Catholic Church did for centuries by blanche formage 3 years ago on Plebit. I totally agree with your point on social capital. This is another person. Anyone who does shokobuku can say goodbye to their social capital, and if someone decides to become a consistent shokobukuer, every relationship that person will create will always have an underlying doubt of legitimacy. Oh my God, cry more, cry more. I quite enjoy this strongman version of Buddhism, even though I may not agree with it totally or at all. It's very interesting how this randomly was in my bundle of notes in my basement storage room for like 25 years. That I just so happened to find this in adulthood, I think is quite auspicious in a way. Then this other guy responds to this even-handed comment about, stop preaching to me that you would be bad first with the last warning. No, you're just a jerky kid and won't respect our site's rules. You won't be permitted to participate. Why do they put so much stock if you can't achieve Buddhahood? Why do they put so much stock in getting people to come to meetings to get their gosen on, buy the publication to take leadership roles? Why fight hard to keep people in to practice if they already guaranteed to achieve enlightenment? Well, I mean, yeah, okay, there's a lot of grifters and there's a lot of charlatans in certain schools of Buddhism. But I think that the sort of like immediate impulse of the atheistic Redditor to just, basically doubt every form of evangelism is like, you know what you're getting, right? It's so, but it's very funny how, okay, yes, there is an implicit form of neoconservatism in this. Obviously, you can take a subversive interpretation to that, you're basically chiding the Islamic world in favor of, well, in America, we have religious toleration. It is sort of like liberal neoconservatism, but only like done by Buddhists instead of end times evangelicals who have a particular fixation with that one nation in the Middle East. I understand that. But what the Islamic world has done to a lot of ancestral Buddhist homes is quite disgusting, in my opinion. And if they're saying that you want to raise Buddha consciousness, and the fruits of the destruction of these teachings, these sutras, and also of these sacred statues and these sacred icons of Buddhism, well, I agree with that. The world's going to hell in a handbasket, and I think it was quite an interesting look, especially on the heels of 9/11, what the world looked like. Of course, nowadays, given the typical leftoid Redditor that still plays lip service to a very westernized, very debased and secular version, atheistic version of Buddhism. And you could argue that Buddhism is inherently atheistic in some respects, but you know what I mean. I mean, like the Western, the soilenial new atheist version of Buddhism. There's that one guy that had these books about it that the new atheist quite enjoyed, tagging along. I forget his name. He was like, what was his name? Richard something? I don't know. I forget, but it's a long history. But so I think it's very interesting how we teleported back in time to the early 2000s. And you could see this was printed off a website or a forum. It doesn't have an author's name. I wonder if there's even an archive of this letter besides the one that I'm holding in my hand. So it's quite interesting. I wonder if you could actually go to their archives. I wonder if they would shy away from it. Like, well, it was after 9/11, and we don't really believe in that. And but whatever. The point being is that there is a warrior impulse within the Buddhist world that often goes unmentioned, especially by Western converts who play up the very lib version of it. And I think it's very fascinating. And the reason I wanted to read this letter is because it found me, and I have this impulse to archive things that I find nostalgic. I mean, I guess I can't escape the soilenial charges. That I find anything from this world in which I was a kid very nostalgic. And I think it really gauges the religious impulse that was going on at the time after such a great calamity, and how 9/11 for both the East and the West denoted a form of apocalypticism that was running through the veins of the world, the spirit for the new sphere, that things had truly come to a head, that time of spoiled innocence that was the 1990s came to a close, at least if you were in the West, that came to a close. But it's very interesting that even the Eastern world, the Buddhist world, felt that uniquely as well. And so I think that this letter that just so happened to be in my possession that I didn't even know I had, happened to find me in adulthood after all of my studies, and I don't know, I felt that it was quite meaningful. So let's move on to another topic. So I hope you appreciated that little reading and analysis. I have a lot of things planned. I don't know exactly. I think for the paywalled aspect, I wanted to rant about this one guy. this one guy talking about Twitter and how it's evil now, and he was like some moderator that Elon fired. But I will talk about in the paywalled version this thing about like third worldism. I read this very good article, incredibly good article, and I will give my thoughts as to wrestling with a lot of these topics. But anyways, this is episode 62. I wanted to start off with more of a personal note. I have a number of things I want to cover. I wanted to cover this Italian art gallery burning their own works. I promised to do the new metal article. And also, there was something that I was discussing while I was editing my book today with Matthew the Stout about the sort of, what would you call it, the New Age revival that happened on the cusp of the 2010s with millennials. And a lot of the metal bands, especially the gent bands, were very open to this type of thing, which I can maybe give a brief history. So this one will be about music. I will talk a little bit about art. By the way, speaking of music and art, and also I'll cover about the third worldism thing, and also another. I don't want to talk about anything about the women discourse. I did this. I joined this Twitter space, Meta Prime's Twitter space. He was promoting this podcast with Amy Therese, and there's a bunch of good Twitter posters. If you go to Meta Prime's account, I believe he recorded it, so you can hear me talk about the media market thing and about people's images of thought when it comes to a lot of these discourses. I think I laid it out pretty well. Actually, you know what? I could probably ask Meta if I can clip it. I'll try to do something. It was a pretty good point. I did quite a long rant about it, so I will ask him to do it. But I don't want to talk about anything. I know a lot of you people, I know you got pretty offended at me going about the whole women gender discourse thing. I received some quite hurtful pushback by some people. They said, Gio, you're so insightful. What happened? You're a simp and you're this and that. And no, I just think that there has to be, I think people are misunderstanding. I think people are misunderstanding my point about not just that it's a distraction, because like Amy Therese actually did bring up something good in that Twitter space, is that even if it's something innocuous or stupid, you still have to pay attention to certain things. But anyways, before I lose people, and I think that, data is analyzed because it brings about a lot of unconscious tics and a lot of unconscious assumptions that people have that is worth analyzing, even if the example themselves are stupid, like this recent one. If you're stranded in the woods, would you choose a bear or some random dude? It's so incredibly ridiculous. And I think that a lot of this discourse is manufactured. Not to say that it's totally manufactured, that someone is guiding it on high, but I'll never discount that totally. But I do think that in terms of certain like agents or posters or people that are like larger accounts on certain groups in terms of like ideology, right? Like Radfems, for instance. Like, I think that there is an unconscious manufacturing of discourse that hits, and this is what I said in this Twitter space, it hits all of the right buttons in terms of a viral phenomenon. And you have to be aware of the fact that it pushes an agenda and the fact that it unleashes a torrent of id-driven unconscious viciousness towards each other, in particular towards, well, in this case, towards like average men. And the fact that a lot of people have a sort of weird, not even direct trauma, but an interpolation of trauma based on the experiences of others. Not to count people as genuine trauma or genuine dealings, unfortunately, with people who are, less than savory characters. But there is a lot of unconscious interpolation through the digital world of people that are claiming, like, friend of a friend of a friend, or even indirectly of like, well, what about this abstract example that then becomes real? Because you have to realize a lot of these things come about because the unconscious mind cannot tell the difference. The unconscious mind is something much more ancient in us, something that operates collectively, and something that takes place on a different level than what Jung called the egoic self of conscious criticism in our minds. Anyways, I think that it's interesting to analyze a lot of the unconscious assumptions people have. A lot of them are fabulated by the media and this is what I said in this Twitter space, that the media often, the Hollywood culture industry machine often portrays perpetrators and victims in certain lights, and there's a certain archetype. And I mentioned, for example, the film Deliverance, where even the lower class country, flyover person, who's usually like a white male in destitute socioeconomic stratas, they're often portrayed also as perpetrators, as well as the high class, sort of like my dad is a lawyer. If we don't have to remember the 2010s campus crisis thing, right? And so that is a media-generated narrative. And a lot of times, the unconscious mind cannot tell the difference when you are being somatized in that entertainment complex. But, I think I'll have to edit this to put this later, because I want to get people with something more important. So, for example, the most destructive piece of media is obviously the whole Law and Order extended universe, where they'll take cases from the 2010s, for example, that were proven demonstrably false, like Jackie from UVA or Duke Lacrosse or Emma Solkowitz and Mattress Girl. They'll take it and they'll say it's real, but now it's real in this fabulized media universe. And of course, the demographic of people that watch these shows all day, daytime television, they're not going to really question the assumptions beyond what is being presented to them as media entertainment. Because the dramatized narrative, you have to realize, often has more of a truth than an actual documentary or an actual presentation of something. And I think this is very dangerous because, again, the unconscious mind cannot tell the difference. It's like when you are observing a wrestling show. Even if you are someone who's been... I'll give you a good example. This goes to the youngin thing. If you're a smart mark, right? A smart mark, if you know what wrestling is like, and if you know the moves that are going to be made, if you have the stats and figures of every wrestler, if you know what a good match is, what a sort of like, a 5-star, or what does Dave Meltzer do? He does like 7 stars now, I think he's up to. And Dave Meltzer, it's like his subjective opinion, but I do think that if you can gauge what a good match is, you really know. You are captivated by it. It has a good sequence, and shockingly, it has psychology and storytelling. Something that a lot of modern wrestling doesn't have. Shocker that, if you get fans invested in something, that suspension of disbelief is lowered. If you really are a wrestling fan, what I highly recommend, I believe Hannibal TV did this interview with Al Snow. And Al Snow, truly one of the great minds of wrestling, even though his career he didn't reach the level of The Rock or Stone Cold or whatever, but it doesn't matter. He's trained a lot of great wrestlers, and he has a mind of the business. He has an old school mentality, and he was going through what kayfabe is. He was going through what selling is, what heat is, and he was really going through what it means to be a good wrestler and to make a good and convincing wrestling match. And the whole thing, it's not that it's really about... Realism is not a good word. It's rather the suspension of disbelief. Because, and this leads to my point, the unconscious mind cannot differentiate between what is that suspension of disbelief, what is being a fabulized narrative, hence why narrative being... There's a really great book about this, about our evolution, and even though I sort of disagree with a lot of points in terms of the sort of fundamentalism around evolutionary psychology, there's a great book about mythology and storytelling and narrative and human development. Now, I think, for example, Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher, is a great hidden gem, and he talked about narrative being, and I had this course of philosophy and literature, we covered it, and then maybe I should dig up my old notes on Paul Ricoeur. But narrative being is more impactful. So, for example, if you're in a wrestling show, especially if you're seeing it live, I know that nowadays a lot of wrestlers, there's no psychology, there's no suspension of disbelief, they just do whatever they want. But, so let's say if you're witnessing a great match, even if you're at home. Now, you may know, for example, that this particular wrestler that's a champion, say when Okada was in New Japan, or say, didn't Cody win against The Rock, or whatever? I haven't watched WWE in quite a long time. But if you're a smart mark, you know the moves, you know that, for example, they're going into a title defense at a lesser pay-per-view or a lesser show. against an opponent that is probably not going to be pushed as the champion unless you have some like totally crazy Vince Russo swerve. By the way, I love Vince Russo. He's pretty base, but anyways. But say you have some crazy Vince Russo swerve, barring that, you know the moves, you know that this champion isn't going to drop the belt. You know Okada is probably going to drop the belt at Wrestle Kingdom. He's not going to drop it at King of Pro Wrestling. He's certainly not going to drop it at wherever, right? So you know, as a smart mark, you are educated, at least somewhat. You don't know anything. You know some things, but you don't know everything. So you are entertained. And there's a moment where reality around you drops away. You're totally invested in this good match. And you are going through the experience as if it's a real fight, as if you don't know that there's an outcome that is quite likely to happen. Unless there's been total shockers, you know what's going to happen. But your unconscious mind, I would even say your soul, does not know what really is going to happen. You are witnessing what Nietzsche called a festival of cruelty. You are witnessing a primordial spectacle of athleticism, of competition, of violence. Because even the most simplest of wrestling moves, I know it's like, okay, it's fake in terms of it's coordinated and there's a predetermined outcome. But wrestling is still real. Those people actually get really hurt. They can, or there's always the looming possibility of it becoming quote unquote real where there's not scripted coordination. Not to say don't do this, but if a normal person were to go out and give someone or take even the most basic of wrestling moves without knowing how to bump, without having any training, without having any cooperation, see what happens. What's going to happen? You've seen the UFC. I remember that one, I think it wasn't in the UFC, it was in Pride. Do you remember Pride? It was Rampage Jackson versus a Japanese MMA fighter. I forget the name, but those who are more familiar with UFC and more familiar with the world of MMA than I am, you could tell me who it is. But Rampage Jackson he was going for a triangle choke. And Rampage Jackson is so swole, he picks him up with one arm, gives him an absolutely brutal power bomb, which is a standard move in wrestling. But it knocked him out, didn't it? It knocked him clean. I think Rampage Jackson gave him a few shiners, did a few ground and pounds just to make sure he was down. Because, that was his style. Like, it didn't matter if, like, Rampage would, he would just go until the referee pulled him off the guy, right? But the point being is that that's a pretty good illustration. But the point being is that your unconscious mind cannot tell the difference. And when you when you're disengaged from that spectacle, then the reality of things comes back into your purview. You can think about things a bit more. You can say, okay, there was a logical progression. Can you imagine that? Isn't that crazy? That wrestlers had logical progressions in storylines within matches? Like, what a novel concept, AEW. Oh my God, right? What a novel concept. Young Bucks, Anyways, what a novel concept, Kenny Omega. I shouldn't bash Kenny Omega, because when he had Guido to control him in New Japan, he did make magic because someone was there to contain him. But anyways, the point being is that, there's a lot of fiction that becomes more real than what is actual reality. There's a lot of things that are more essentially aware and more ready to the subject on a deeper level than what is just presented. So, for example, when you're in a fight on social media, where you largely do not have the same faculties of thinking and awareness, if you're being guided by a discursive current, then a lot of being taken up in that discourse is then experienced secondhand. And that your thoughts and feelings and emotions can be swelled into, and you're not really thinking rationally. in a way, but reason isn't a part of it, because I know that reason isn't the be-all and end-all of things. That there is something that is deeper than even reason that gets taken up in a lot of what we experience in daily life. And because a lot of what we experience is detached from the immediate sensual reality of the physical, and because a lot of it is narrative driven, a lot of it is the psychical pollution of being exposed to people's thoughts and feelings every single day on a raw basis, even if they're just anons. But then you get taken up into that storm, into the swarm, as Byung-Chul Han says. And then you don't really think about things. You go along with opinions because you can rationally say, okay, now, if I'm in a survival situation with a man, yeah, every man can potentially be dangerous, but at the same time, if you're both stranded, there is a necessity towards cooperation in survival situations. And I think that there could be a danger. And then they're like, then they say stupid things like, well, a man can't be reasoned with. The bear is just a natural thing. And they have this like wholesome chungus view of bears. Bear attacks never happen, right? And they're like, well, someone who wants to hurt you, they can't be reasoned with. And it's like, well, if you're both together and you're both stranded, I think that there's a necessity for cooperation and reason. And this has been demonstrably proven time and again, that the sort of Lord of the Flies scenarios is almost an after effect of particular forms of socialization within a survival situation. That actually, when you're that there is evidence to support that cooperation is a pretty good metric, is a pretty good gauge of how people respond in survival situations. But that's besides the point. It's just a stupid thought experiment. Like all thought probes and thought experiments and hypotheticals, a lot of them are basically discursive traps that don't really serve people's interests. And look, lo and behold, I've been talking about this. So my point being is that, okay, let's not talk about the gender war stuff. It's unavoidable, but the point I'm trying to make, even beyond the gender war stuff, but although I would say that the gender war stuff is very close to people's hearts and imaginations, because there's a lizard brain libidinal element to it. But in all elements, in terms of not just that issue, but all issues, where there is clear emotional manipulation based on the virality of certain phenomenon and certain news events, or even taking a fictionalized depiction of reality as if it is fact. A lot of people do this. A lot of people, they have a lot of assumptions that were given to them about factoids and tidbits of information in Hollywood films. And a lot of people can't discern that maybe that's not real. Like, a lot of people thought that you can, like, suck poison out of a snake bite. That's not real. A lot of people, for example, after that one film about the wine snobs, I believe Paul Giamatti was in it. I think he was in it. Like, people, they stopped buying Merlot for a period because they're like, oh, Merlot is pedestrian or whatever. It's like, it's crazy. A lot of people have a lot of unconscious assumptions because of fiction, because of the power of it. So when you have, like, for example, the Law and Order situation, where it's like, this historic case that was proven to be false, it's real now. Like, do you remember the Gamergate episode? Right? And so I think that, that is the problem with a lot of, unfortunately, a shocking number of people nowadays, is that they have to, that even in the online world, barring Hollywood culture industry productions, people create their own spectacles onto themselves that they then follow through on. And so let's take a music break, because I'm sure that I've explained this Buddhism thing beforehand. So let's take a music break from another selection by Philip Daniel, and then we'll get to the music element. And by the way, did you like how did you recognize the title of last episode? Deserted Cities of the Heart is actually one of my favorite Cream songs. But I think that Cream is interesting because that We're Going Wrong, even White Room to an extent. And there's another, I remember reading this one blogger I forget the name of it, but it was talking about, it may have been even a YouTube comment. I think it was a blog post. There was a weird form of post-apocalypticism in Cream that it's almost as if they were gauging the unconscious of the 60s. That they were gauging the calamitous events and calamitous social climate and even the calamitous spiritual condition that the hippies had wrought upon the Western world. And there's a lot of that symbolism, a lot of the great lyricism of the poet Pete Brown, who wrote a lot of Cream lyrics. There's a lot of elements of really an apocalypticism. And I think they were going through, and even though a lot of most boomers, they view it as like this amazing time of free love and peace and changing social norms and protest and the jouissance of being a youth radical, there is still there's a lot of collapse and decay that went hidden. And I think Cream in a lot of songs really did gauge that. That's why they were brilliant. And I think that even the lyrics to Deserted Cities of the Heart, if you ever had a chance to pull up the lyrics, there is that tone in Cream of things falling apart, of things going off the rails. And there's a lot of songs of celebration and ecstasy as well, like Tales of Brave Ulysses, for example. But there is that sense of impending apocalypticism in Cream that I quite like. I'll just pull up the lyrics really quickly. So in a sense, it's almost like a lot of similar themes that, for example, in Tales of Brave Ulysses, there is like that theme of the epic hero facing the confrontation with a decaying social order, with a society that is really experiencing a form of end times. And in a sense, in a weird reactionary way, the 60s was sort of like a spiritual end times for a previous social order. It was the capstone of the 20th century that was then leading into the world that we inhabit nowadays. Really. So upon these streets where time has died, the golden tread you never tried, in times of old, in days gone by, if I could catch your dancing eye, it was on the way, on the road to dreams. Now my heart's drowned in no love streams. The street is cold, the trees are gone, the story's told, the darkness has won. Once we set sail to catch a star, we had to fail, it was too far. That was the disrupted utopianism of the 60s. That was, in a way, the West as an epic hero that tragically, like Nietzsche's tightrope walker, falls in ascent. And of course you could say, okay, it's like a love song as well. But in a way, it's like on the road to dreams, now my heart's drowned in no love streams. On this dark street, the sun is black, the winter life is coming back. The winter, Spangler, hello? The Spanglerian winter. On this dark street, it's cold inside. There's no retreat from time that's died. You cannot go back. You can only go through. When those times have passed from the civilizational world picture, you can't really get those things back. You are in a winter phase. So in a way, Cream, as this stellar example of acid rock and 60s music, they were really lamenting what the 60s have brought about. I felt the wind shout like a drum. You said, my friend, love's end has come. It couldn't last, had to stop. You drained it all to the last drop. Free love. It ended. It was disrupted. It was an after the orgy society that Baudrillard talks about. It is that sort of sanguine, sullen, lamentuous type of existence that happened, for example, directly in the 70s. And so really, Deserted Cities of the Heart, and I wish I would have gone through it last episode, that was really the peak, and only the insight of Cream interpreted that. It interpreted the sort of fall of a civilization entering a winter period, the fall of free love, mulling over into this coldness. Even another song on the same album, right? Another, was it a Disraeli Gear? Oh, sorry, Wheels of Fire, Wheels of Fire. Those were the days. These are the lyrics to Those Were the Days. When the city of Atlantis stood serene above the sea, long time before our time when the world was free. Those were the days. Golden cymbals flying on ocarina sounds before wild Medusa's serpent gave birth to hell, disguised as heaven. Remember, Medusa seduced the fallen men who were to slay her as a heavenly picture before they were turning to stone. Those are the days, yes, those are the days. Those were their wares, miracles everywhere. Where are they now? They were gone. Those were their ways, yes, those were their ways. Those were their days, those were the days. Tie your painted shoe and dance, blue daylight in your hair, overheard a noiseless eagle fan a flame, wonder everywhere. Those are the days. Yes, they were the days. Those were the days. Meaning that there is a mythological significance to the closing of the ancient world that has mimicked the closing of our previous world in the 1960s. And that is why Pete Brown and Jack Bruce, and I believe also, I think Eric Clapton wrote a few songs here and there in terms of the lyrics, but this is so brilliant. It's really the closing of a mythological period, a period of wonder where things were real, where the gods shone down from heaven. And now those times are gone. Those were the days. Atlantis fell. We are in our winter period. No longer are we enraptured by the flight of the phoenix, by the sound of ocarina seas. It is gone from us. And I think that's why Cream truly is... I think I talked about this a long time ago. Why Cream is truly brilliant, because they were gauging what was actually going on in the 60s. What was actually going on in terms of a civilization that for a time experienced the last drop of ecstasy before a fall. And I think that's why there's such an apocalypticism. There's that vibe when you actually listen. Go and listen to that album, Wheels of Fire. Go and listen to it, and you will listen to it in a new light. That it is a lament. So I think it's brilliant. I think, anyways, I talk. This is going to be a music show. This is going to be like a lot of philosophy, some artwork, and I think so. Let's have a little music break, as customary, with some new selections by Philip Daniel. Back, and I think I'll talk about that thread about Twitter and safety by some guy, aging soy jack, because it does bring up a important point about like what these people view as important in terms of the online world, and they're not digital natives, they're not netocrats, they don't know what they're talking about. They really are evil. I would say. They are evil mites that are eating away at the experiences of the online world, and they are trying to destroy the authentic experiences of people who are netocrats. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the music by Philip Daniel, because we're talking about something completely opposite, which is nu metal. And I promised, I teased this for a few weeks, but I just never got to talk about it. And maybe there's a lot of material. Maybe I will save my observations for the 2010s gent phenomenon and the New Age movement, or I would say pre-2010s. But maybe I'll talk a little bit about it. But in the paywalled version, I want to talk about another article that was written about third worldism. And the interview that Tuckler did with the Rasputin figure. I'm not gonna joke. He's not that, but the interview he did with a certain Russian philosopher and polemical thinker. That I think as much as I said this on Orange Show, as much as I find value in some of the things that Dugin talks about, I have a lot of serious critiques of his worldview, and as sympathetic as I am to the Russians not wanting to be meddled with by NATO and a lot of the satanic elites that run North America and Europe, I think that his approach to it is flawed in severe ways. Anyways, so I don't consider myself a Duginite or whatever. And despite what some people would say, I am starting to, not starting to, it's been a while now, questioning my sympathies towards a lot of the different regions of the globe. I think in terms of intellectual curiosity, especially when it comes to perennialism and the way that perennialism intersects with politics, I think that there still is something to be obtained there, while respecting the differences that each civilization, and particularly between Western Faustian man and the Magian Islamic civilization. And I think that some statements Dugin makes is kind of wow, really out there. But anyways, so I have a number of critiques, and I've read this article by that French poster, Fleur in Verse, who's a great writer, and I believe he can read texts that haven't been translated into English yet. So it's quite a good article, because I think that the subject matter he talks about is, of course, never discussed in academia for obvious reasons, because some of the thinkers he mentions in terms of this creation of what he terms the other third worldism, the right-wing third worldism, the certain regime in the 20th century. Anyways, I highly suggest you subscribe to the Patreon and to Substack for excellent content. And I think I truly struggle, because I do have a lot of sympathies with a lot of different cultures around the globe and a lot of different world religions. I started this talk about Buddhism. So, but anyways, there's this excellent article, although I do think as a critique, and I will cover a few articles people requested for Giant Reviews. And if you want me to read your article, you know my usual fee, PayPal in the bio, in the Linktree down below, on the information down below, in my Linktree. So at the end of me and Default's interview with Scott Greer about the history of the alt-right, we sort of tussle a little bit, and I don't wish... You know what? Actually, I think he would respect me more if I call out Scott Greer, and I attack him, and I say that he is wrong, and that he should debate me, bro, on this point about nu metal. So maybe I'll have Scott Greer on the show, and I think that it'll be a fun time. But anyways, I realize I say and and let's face it. I know that's in the Digital Archipelago bingo card someone made. Let's face it. Equivocate. I equivocate a lot. I know this because it's part of my OPSEC game. It's a lesson I learned. I haven't talked to him in years, though, but from a man who truly gave me my start, Adam Wallace, to layer truth and to layer your opinions in as much esoteria to evade censorship. I guess it's Straussian in a way, but I don't consider myself a Straussian, but that I think the evasion thesis, the thesis of hiddenness, is pretty accurate, but I know I've certainly been accustomed to, maybe I shouldn't even reveal my cards, but let's face it, I try to have the best possible phrasing of certain very sticky issues. I might get you in trouble. But anyways, to call out Scott Greer, I'm not calling out Scott Greer. I wanted to read this. So this is called In Defense of Nu Metal, a second consideration of artistic expression. Now, the Substack is called The New Metal Scholar by Trauma Bong, and his Twitter handle is called Gamer Scholar at BPD Castellanos. So Castle, like CASTELLANANOS, and I'll link in the bio the article. So Gamer Scholar delivers, I think, and he goes into a lot of different areas that are worth covering, but even though it's somewhat haphazard, I do think that there is a lot of work to be done in terms of why nu metal, despite numerous despite millennials for a period saying this is trash and this is terrible and we hated it and everyone hated it, to now have this sort of begrudging respect for the place it occupied in the millennial psyche, especially the older millennial psyche. Because you have to remember, Gen X, they were coming of age in the 90s, like core Gen X. They had grunge, they had Florida death metal, they had alternative music, and all those things are great. Well, I mean, grunge is a mixed bag. I'm obviously more of a fan of Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, and I had a Nirvana phase when I was in high school. But anyways, I've sort of grown out of it. And I think that, well, because Alice in Chains should have just been a metal band. You know, it's funny how grunge was such an open template. I had a thread about grunge once. That Stone Temple Pilots and Soundgarden, they should have been classic rock bands, but were classified as grunge. Nirvana definitely should have just been a punk band, or they wanted to just be a punk band. And Alice in Chains, a lot of those guys came from metal. They came from a lot of the metal bands that were covered over in Seattle at the time, such as Nevermore. I remember Jim Shepard, the bassist of Nevermore. He was actually in a band with Lane Staley. And I don't know, I'm crossed because Warrell Dane would obviously be my favorite singer of all time. God rest his soul. And also God rest Lane Staley's soul. But I think those are my two favorite singers, apart from Lord Worm and a few other metal singers. Anyways, Gamer Scholar writes in defense of nu metal. Dearest readers, I have confession to make. I love nu metal. Isn't that like just coming? It's like back in the day, like it's you're coming out to your parents. You're coming out to the internet. I love nu metal. No, I'm kidding. I love nearly everything of it. The unrestrained vomiting of emotions, the abysmally down-tuned growl of the guitars. Yeah, that was, of course, pioneered. They got that sound from certain bands that were in Florida around the time. But I would say that nu metal comes out of course, Pantera, but a hidden influence would be Sepultura, and then later Soulfly. Because Max Cavalera, he collaborated with a lot of them. I mean, Roots as an album has a lot of, it has Jonathan Davis on it, has other nu metal stars. Or people, because in what did it come out, 96? A lot of those nu metal guys, like, they weren't as prominent as nowadays. I think Korn was starting to become prominent. Of course, the single for Blind came out. But Roots as an album as a whole, that was instrumental in the nu metal sound. And that song, that tune, that tone, the timbre of the Fender that Andreas Kisar managed to get, I think was a huge inspiration. And then, of course, a lot of the pioneers of nu metal, such as Brian Head Welsh, switched over to the 7-string, and that created... And I remember this one interview, it comes a long time ago. It was with Monkey and Head from Korn, where they explained that they didn't want, like, total chuggy thrash, or they didn't want the chugginess of Florida Death, and they didn't want the rapid fire of thrash metal, but they wanted to find something that was more brooding and more heavy. And some people say it's heavy on the cheap because you're using a different octave entirely. But I would say that it suited the sound because you can open up the guitar work to melody and to rhythm. And of course, a lot of these guys were inspired. Let's face it, they were inspired by hip hop, but they used it in such a way as to get, and they were, of course, them and Wes Borland from Limp Bizkit, they were all pedal freaks. They had these huge, like Wes Borland just had like 2 rows deep of this 20 pedal board that would just like it would be like kind of like a prayer circle with different a prayer circle of different pedals that he would experiment with. I believe also the guitarist, when they were doing a little bit of a more nu metal sound, the guitarist to Incubus also was like this. They were always experimenting with different sounds, and they would really try to have a form of heaviness, but a heaviness that was not necessarily the heaviness of death metal, but was more brooding and could open up the template, the sonic template for melodies. Because you have to realize a lot of nu metal is just choruses. Don't bore us, get to the... Like, that's what Korn is. Don't bore us, get to the chorus. Korn is a very chorus-driven band. A lot of nu metal is incredibly chorus-driven, and they had to do that because if you're taking away solos... There were some nu metal bands that did reintroduce the solo, such as Godsmack. I mean, Godsmack, they were influenced by a lot of, like, 80s stuff. But because you're taking out the chorus, now you have to find more creative ways to get people hooked on the songs. Even Korn would have, like, these little parts here and there. Like, one of my favorite songs is, like, Let's Get the Party Started. They go into this brilliant breakdown with all of this distortion, and then they had, I believe, Head was doing these guitar swells, or this picking, where it sounded like China bells, and then Jonathan Davis had this very long, drawn, raspy type of almost yelling, and you could almost picture like a music video where he's doing that. So yeah, there was a lot of creativity with nu metal because they had to find ways to break the usual template. Now, for example, you have bands like Death in Florida death metal. It was standard tuning, but because Chuck Schuldiner was truly a brilliant songwriter, not as necessarily like a great, like a amazing transcendental guitarist like John Petrucci or Rusty Cooley or who else am I thinking of? Like, guitar guys, right? Like Steve Vai. But he compensated by actually being a brilliant songwriter, and he knew how to write a riff that was heavy in standard tuning, but he did it in such a way that you didn't have to really down tune, have a lot of unnecessary distortion. There was a lot of plays in terms of reverb and chorus. Chuck Schuldiner really loved the chorus pedals, but he played in a different way that really made it. It really sunk in. And there's this video on YouTube where this guy, he plays a lot of death, like iconic death riffs, especially the last 4 albums. He plays them clean, and they almost sound like folk songs, like almost like minstrel, like medieval folk. You can almost hear that. But that's how brilliant Chuck Schuldiner was. And Death was also a major influence on a lot of nu metal. And you know what's funny? Who was a big influence on death metal in general, especially when it came to bands like Pantera, was of course the king of all chuds, the king of all boomer cons, Ted Nugent. Ted Nugent was a huge inspiration, both in his guitar playing, but also his onstage presence towards certainly Dimebag from Pantera, and of course the guys in Cannibal Corpse, such as Pat O'Brien, huge Ted Nugent fan. So Ted Nugent really did inspire a lot of death metal, by the way. His playing style, the way that he changed a lot of stuff up in the 80s, he incorporated certain electronic sounds here and there. But anyways, let's get to nu metal. Perhaps it's less of a confession than an address of proverbial elephant in the room. After all, the pseudonym under which these writings are penned itself contains the name is often malign genre. Given my time among reactionaries and far-right influencers, it is understandable that the viewer may gaze at the name nu metal scholar and wonder offhandedly what's the deal with that. And by the way, there is a leftist colonization of nu metal. It's very tragic, but it's true. Lest you still think better of me than you ought to, I should not fail to mention that this is not my only sin among the medievalist, primitivist cliques that form much of the wayward dissident right. Well, whatever happened to them, I don't know. It's the primitivists. They sort of got bodied in 2019, but anyways. I also have a fondness for bossa nova, pop punk, jazz fusion, and post-hardcore. Soillennial alert. Soillennial. I mean, hey, I'm right up there with you, you know, except for the pop punk. But even still, when I hear it, it's like it's a nostalgia thing. Like I was in the car one time with my best friend IRL, and this older Sum 41 song came up, and I'm like, you know what? Hey, let's listen to it. I remember I was driving to see my GF once, and the local butt rock radio station, they played that one song by Treble Charger called 100 Million People. You know that one? 100 million people thinking my way now. And I believe the guys from Sum 41 actually helped Treble Charger do that song. And I'm thinking, what if a frog edited that? Like 100 million people thinking my way? Never mind. I'm not going to give this meme idea. If there's any frogs out there that want to meme, that want to do an old school Biggie Slunk / Nuke Telly edit of 100 million people from Trouble Charger, I'm not giving you any ideas, okay? I'm not saying anything. But anyways, I prefer these styles to folk music, although flamenco is a source of fascination, and seldom listen to much music that any of the usual distant right figureheads would consider as being traditional. Nor do I love to brag of a fondness for silence, as do the ex-microblogging mystics and contemplatives. Sometimes silence is alright. I'm not alone. Over the last year or two, it has been pleasure to see a growing number of anons with the courage to admit an enjoyment of cultural expressions from within their own lifetime. Like me and nu metal. I hope he's thinking of me. Although he doesn't follow me on Twitter. Like, what is Gamer Scholar doing? He needs to follow me on Twitter. Anyways, honestly, after all, is among the few assets the right generally has at its disposal is nostalgia. As it's been demonstrated before in this humble blog, optics are no excuse for deceit. Hence the prevailing sentiments of fake it till you make it or LARPing is good, especially when it comes to one's presentation of their spirituality to others. Belie no virtue, but rather vices of great ignominy. With that, we are brought to yet another friendly critique of the dissident right. Its dullness is the dimension of the aesthetical. You see, in addition to the many pitfalls associated with rampant Machiavellian tendencies in their thought, the thinkers of the right also possess an impoverished understanding of the arts. Well, that I can't argue with that one. The role of artists in the proper enjoyment of the former. They most definitely would object to the admissions of the meager author provided thus far. This is because they lack the distinction necessary to convince of any human activity from the 20th century or beyond is something other than part of modernity, an ambiguous but wholly malevolent socio-political force that can be called upon to explain every single evil. To be sure, modernity is a very real and prevalent threat, but a more nuanced conception of its role in history is vital to the flourishing of the human rational animal in a world left asunder by the collapse of the Enlightenment and the failure of the post-historic era. So, of course, the failure of post-history from the 1990s, or the closing of the 1990s with the two towers falling down. In order to elucidate such a thing, let us return to the subject of nu metal and the disdain it may elicit from some traditionalists. It is impossible, the bellicose trad may say, to be a true reactionary and experience deep enjoyment of something such as nu metal, for no less than 3 reasons. A, it is undeniably vulgar, that is contrary to the good, the true, and the beautiful. I don't exactly agree with that. B, it is thoroughly nihilistic. Again, something I don't exactly agree with. And C, it is not aspirational, which here means that it lacks the impressive artistry of previous historical epochs. Well, I would agree it does lack the artistry of previous historical epochs. I think nu metal is incredibly aspirational if you actually know what you're listening to. But I think Nu Metal Scholar will get to that. Note that we pursue a response to each of these propositions. It will be found that they can be appropriated against creative artifacts that extend far beyond nu metal or even the musical realm, of course, in the realm of the visual arts. As mentioned previously, more or less everything in the last 24 years and the century before it had been identified as undesirable symptoms of modernity. With regard to the first of the accusations, it may be recounted that the phrase "the good, the true, and the beautiful" is often invoked in a manner most obfuscating by the denizens of the dissident right. While the author shares a general sense of reverence for something or some such notion based, as it has for the naysayers of nu metal, purely on a vague intuition of what those three words together might mean. And this is a huge call out to just repeat it, the true, the good, the beautiful, without actually understanding it. Remember, even Schopenhauer, I said this in my book, even Schopenhauer said that ruins can be beautiful. Why are we so attracted to urban exploration videos, or at least they were pretty popular a few years ago? It cannot escape notice that the verbal wizardry playing upon the intentionally uninscribed reference is being cast upon the listener. In any case, we will rebut this charge as best we can, given the metaphysics as applied to what has been said. For one, nu metal is a creation, unless in the sense it is a material good. It, as creation, cannot be said to be intrinsic evil. To speak of its truth, it would be necessary to indulge in the discussing what makes it so appealing to its audience, namely its satisfying visceral rituals of catharsis. Catharsis, being known even to the ancients, represents no novelty in the history of creative endeavors. Nu metal as catharsis can be heard as the admission of one's own madness in the face of the conditions of modernity, be it the throes of addiction, rejection, dissolution of the nuclear family, or the frenetic paranoia brought on by systematized isolation, at times desperate and maniacal, as others vicious and inarticulate. It conveys the very scream pent up over the course of hours or even months of mind-numbing tedium and artifice. In being let go, however, the power of this scream presents itself. No longer is the miasmic storm of emotions ubiquitous throughout the halls of the mind. Now it is determinate, rendered finite by its very depiction through this vocalization, becoming something to surpass. In time, it may even become a decoration, a trophy from perseverance in the face of conflict. Now, that is an incredibly important point, I would say. You have to realize the socioeconomic conditions of the later millennials that enjoyed nu metal. You have to realize that the opulence of the 1990s was not there. It had gone. The world was experiencing a major shift. And nu metal was, and a lot of people charge nu metal with being overtly downtrodden and whiny, and it has a lot of the same resentment that's present in rap and hip-hop. Now, that's certainly true in part, but I do think that there is a section by which there is a sort of a weird uplifting feeling in nu metal, in that act of catharsis. Even if the lyrics are incredibly simplistic. Like if you listen to songs like Dry Cell, there was a lot of these songs were like in soundtracks for movies like Queen of the Damned, Mallrats, Gummo. Well, Gummo had a lot of black metal. For example, the Dry Cell song, what was it called? What was it called? Body Crumbles. That one, Body Crumbles. If you look at a lot of even Korn songs, if you look at a lot of Mudvayne, I think that lyrically is probably the most poetic nu metal could ever get, because Chad Gray is such a great songwriter in terms of lyrics. Especially LD50 had a whole theme behind it. And I think that there is a lot of hidden uplifting in the sense that you are persevering through something. You are related to the socioeconomic conditions around you. It is a time of uncertainty, but yet you are struggling in this primal scream to express it. And that's why you have a lot of teen angst as the main theme of nu metal. Especially Korn really did speak to that generation. When Freak on a Leash came out, that was like truly a huge turning point. When that music video came out, and you could really see that now, because grunge as youth music was commodified like punk was. It was bought and sold to you by MTV and by fashion companies. But the nu metal came along as this like dirty, sleazy, like suburban, like those, like the kids in suburbia, the sort of trash that can't get along in decent society, but are adjacent to like this normative notion of what proper society was that was then fading away. And nu metal really was, even before the hipster, the 2000s hipster, was a sign of the downward mobility of largely the white middle class youth. That's why nu metal had such an appeal. Even art, music critics, they talk about this with Woodstock '99 and how evil and terrible it was, and how Coachella was the great progressive granola type of, in the early '90s had like shoegaze and grunge, and they were open to different, and they were open to like alternative lifestyles and alternative gender expressions. And then the evil, dirty, rotten nu metal came along, and they just polluted everything, because now who largely listened to it? Oh yes, young white men. There was a lot of Asian kids, a lot of African American kids that love nu metal. But let's face it, we all know that there is an expression at the heart of suburbia, of the young man in particular, that were in the beginning stages of being suppressed by all culture. Because, of course, if you were an urban African-American youth, the hip-hopification of all pop culture was on its ascendancy. And by the time you get to the 2010s, it's all over. Hip-hop had taken over everything. The culture industry nowadays is acutely aware of the aesthetics and the verbal tics and the music of hip-hop. And it's really just... nu metal was one of the last youth culture music for the young man in Western civilization that could express his frustration and anger and pent-up rage at the frustrated promises that were given to him by the boomers. So I think that was the significance and importance of nu metal. But let's read on. So then he says, in defense of nu metal, here too is beauty, an exhibition of one's deepest and most primal reactions to the disquiet at the turn of the century, making them comfortingly familiar. The commendable honesty of the scream is rewarded with the fortitude to leave the agony behind. And that's a crucial point. That's a crucial point. It's about overcoming one's agony. A lot of nu metal bands did have, especially like Slipknot, the songs like Left Behind, it was just about wallowing in it. But a lot of other nu metal bands, especially the more obscure ones, they gave a voice to it, and then you overcome it. Like, for example, bands like Cold, even Stained to an extent later on, became about the overcoming of it, even though the earlier stuff was very much like teen angst, wallowing in it. Bands like Flaw. Do you remember Flaw? They were great, weren't they? Right? That one music video, like, it was a lament of sunsetting, addiction, downward mobility, but it did have a sort of, at certain moments, that crucial element of uplifting and overcoming. A number of musical, cinematic, and literary styles can be said to contain similar cathartic value, albeit with emphasis on different emotional hues and under different expressions of landscapes. With regards to the purported nihilism, it is important to call to mind a simple principle of creative exposition, which is that the inclusion of certain elements in a lyric, story, or scene are by no means an endorsement of these elements as morally permissible, in whole or in part. A Christian should experience little struggle with this notion, given that events recalled in the scriptures often include expressing moral failures of the various figures involved, while others' activities are no longer culturally acceptable for reasons that do not pertain to unchanging divine law. Children are more impressionable. Let's skip ahead. To more directly address the claims made regarding nihilism, a number of key figures from influential nu metal bands' outfits have expressed more than a passing interest in Christianity over the years, including Brian Head Welch of Korn, Fred Durst of Limp Bizkit. Well, and there was, of course, Christian nu metal bands. POD comes to mind. While their individual understanding and practice of faith may be deeply flawed, it is nevertheless doubtful that they would describe themselves as nihilists per se. We must remember that it is not illicit for the Christian to assign views to others, particularly when those views are erroneous enough to incur the sin of evil suspicion. While it's not impossible for an artist to be a nihilist in theory, there is no good reason to attribute such a belief system to any individual public figure. short of their expressing of the use of the term to define themselves, must now confront the aspirations of new metal, or lack thereof, and therefore complete our refutation of the traditionalist interlocutors. On the outset, it will state as charitably as possible that in spite of frequent pretenses to the contrary, there are few truly refined listeners in the dissident right. There are almost no one with the requisite knowledge, well, except for, I would think, Brahms' respecter. There's almost no one with the requisite knowledge of music theory and experience with different styles necessary to make evaluations of any kind. Even the higher echelons of commentators in the sphere are more or less as competent as Anthony Fantano, ever true, or Robert Christgau at music analysis. Astute readers will perceive this as a bitter insult. Well, it kind of is. But in all fairness, the broader public is pervaded by ignorance of music as well, and this means more as an invitation to explore the subject to a greater degree rather than an attack. While it's true that some earlier instantiations of the metal style, such as Linkin Park, featured less prominent focus on virtuosic lead guitar playing, this was often a strategic decision to allow other aspects of the musical composition to rise to the foreground. You see? Exactly, yeah. Chester Bennington's vocal delivery requires little in the way of apologetics, and the band's interest in sound design meant that only so much time could be spent on guitar showmanship. But I would say that Linkin Park does occupy a very like memified place within the millennial psyche. The nostalgia for hybrid theory in particular. My favorite song was always One Step Closer, and then another favorite song was, what was it called? Faint? I think Faint, yeah. The reason I love Faint is because I remember when I was a kid, I downloaded off of LimeWire this music video for he wasn't even, I think he was just in TNA at that time, but the wrestler Amazing Red, when he was still in like CZW and Ring of Honor, and like early TNA, when he had that match with Loki, I remember that they played, I won't be ignored. Like, I remember that, man. That was, yeah, that really, even to this day, people still rock, Linkin Park, even though I'm not a big fan of Linkin Park. Later acts like Mudvayne centered rhythmic sections in ways that would have been rare for metal acts prior to the 90s. Ryan Martini's innovative and technically demanding bass playing compensated for a lack of ostentatious lead guitar. I would say that Greg Trebet is a good songwriter, though, for Mudvayne, but Ryan Martini does really steal the show. Without his bass playing, and without Chad Gray's lyrical ability and vocal ability, Mudvayne wouldn't be as recognizable, of course. Even so, outfits such as Slipknot, System of a Down, and Static X. Well, System of a Down is loved by like a lot of people because they did have this sort of like the old school leftoid third worldism that was, around the Bush administration. That was it was like cribbing from Rage Against the Machines. But I would say early System of a Down is, I still like listen to that. You know what I mean? Like Toxicity, Steal This, And Static X would go, of course Static X is incredible. Would go on to include thrashier, 16-note pulses and riffs at tempos exceeding 160 beats per minute. Technical guitar solos made a return before long as well. Alternative picking scholar patterns on the solos played in Slipknot's Psychosocial, clocking at nearly 15 notes per second, an extraordinary feat of musicianship by any standards. Keep in mind that the radio rock of previous eras could just as often be based on simple power chords played at easygoing speeds, with most of the challenge focused in one 15 to 30 second guitar performance. Of course, a traditionalist would likely try to argue that the standard for comparison should always be Bach or Scarlatti, ignoring that classical music was seen as being part of the entirely separate art tradition, even when it was first being composed. It is noted as though this compositional approach was out of existence, and the simpler music of the folk tradition that became modern blues, pop, and rock suddenly emerged with the arrival of modernity. That such things go unnoticed by many would-be cultural critics of the dissident right speaks volumes of its need for more serious reflection in these matters. In closing, we must recall the virtue of honesty. It cannot be overstated that a sense of belonging in the cultural deposit of the era in which one was actually born is not any kind of deficiency, and certainly not a precursor to progressivism. Exactly, you are where you're born into, whether you like it or not. And you have to heroically stand atop of it. It is more of a faithful execution of the old slogan, become who you really are. This is an important means of steadying against an existential orientation that is constantly backward-facing, imagining that the real beginning of all of our problems started at this or that point further and further into the bowels of history. Let me skip ahead. It would be true that there is something of our ancestors in all of us. There is nothing wrong with the mission of a heroic figure of time past. Must hold fast to this truth. This age is not a note-for-note, beat-for-beat recapitulation of any prior episode in European and American history, and we are, for better or worse, irrevocably shaped by our actual upbringing, circumstances, and unique personal natures. We are not first millennium mystics, though we may find them a source of needed inspiration. There is hope, however, as faith dictates that was meant for just the place we happen to be in. Lastly, those privy to the relative stability of the post-Cold War era led from 1991 through 2008 have sufficient reason to mourn, and they should be allowed to do so. Rest assured, you are not insane. Things really were starkly unlike they are now, probably just a little over a decade ago. Unscrupulous reactionaries think it's necessary to bewilder you by insisting it was always as it is now, cold and hostile, but this is cruel trickery. Das sign remains never half full, for the other is perpetually half empty. Neither can be seen has the power to accept the present. Mourning a loss, and loss as we know it to be, is the most human necessary thing. Inevitably, notwithstanding to wake from the dream of the 1990s, is to admit that a dream it was. The hopes of the Enlightenment, hopes of 100 years in the cultivating, wilted like a rose in less than 2 decades, ill-fated as they were by the falsehoods of infinite growth and unending human malleability. Then he talks about the distant right. Suffice to say, for now, the rigid lines have never existed around cultural forms, music or otherwise. Unfortunately, no such thing as records for hasiety of diaspora's cultural output to be preserved. All of this approach upon other subjects will have to wait until later. For the moment, I leave my valued audience to ponder these things until I return, hopefully much nearer to now than when last I wrote. When next we meet, I shall like to entreat you to my most ambitious work yet, a comprehensive debunking of traditionalism, with the goal of strengthening the distant right as iron sharpens iron, and hopefully he comes out with it. So I think that was a great piece. I mean, there could have been more of an elaboration on certain things, but he did come out with it. Part 1, the trouble in traditionalist town, the debunking of dissonant wisdom. So hopefully I'll read through it, and I could see if his critique is valid. I definitely will read it, and maybe I will promote it. But anyways, that was a great... I think he should have focused a bit more on the actual nu metal bands themselves, but I think I've filled in some of the gaps. For a genre that had bands that were immensely popular to this day, but yet everyone claimed that they hated them, it's very interesting. And I think that some people are giving themselves a license to rediscover them and view them in a more favorable light. And a perfect example of this, although they did stray a bit into nu metal, but they were much more of something else. And they had a nu metal flavor too, but they had more of a post-grunge flavor to them. But for example, the recent Zoomer interest in Creed, but also the rediscovery by millennials and the Zoomer interest in Limp Bizkit. I said this in Twitter because there was this video essay or this music channel thing about Slipknot being like this crass touring show. They have an idea that it's going to be like a touring show. They're not going to make new music. It doesn't matter if they have original members. They keep switching out members for no reason. And it really just went downhill after Joey Jordison passed. And and of course Corey Taylor's like a lib, and he, people think he's this like deep thinker, but it's like, come on, it's not, well. But notice how people, as much as they got so much hate, and they were bashed as terrible and disgusting and vulgar, in actuality, Fred Durst has arisen as the true hire of the millennial psyche, the true heir. And that he really came out as more authentic and more, I would say, deeply sincere than a lot of other musicians that came out of his day, out of his time period. Because I think that was an appeal of nu metal. It still is to this day. even Zoomers that are listening to the weird mix of early to mid 2000s post grunge and new metal and pop punk, whether it be, like Breaking Benjamin, Sum 41, even early Nickelback. People are discovering something I've said for years, which is that early Nickelback is really quite amazing. Go and listen to the album Curb. The musicianship was on an next level. Of course, the new stuff is all it's all like poppy and it's not very good. But the deep emotions that were running through Curb and The State and even Silver Side Up is really quite fascinating. And even their EP Hesher is quite good too. Because you have to realize that Nickelback, before they ascended to this popularity for a time in the 2000s, they were known as like the Canadian like dude weed poser band that would play in clubs, and that's what they were known for. And I think that even when you go back to listen to Avril Lavigne, me and Matthew started talking about this, the first few albums of Avril Lavigne, a lot of them could be translated into metal songs, and there was a very an authenticity. And you have to be a leaf to know this. I mentioned this before. But Avril Lavigne was cribbing a lot from Alanis Morissette and even a lot of the alternative rock that were led by women in the 90s that gave you that gave an outlet to the young women who were sort of nerdy and didn't really find a role or a place. And of course, she adopted a lot of the punk aesthetic. But a lot of the sort of, I would say, the Daria types that grew up in the 90s listening to Alanis Morissette, listening to, like bands like Luscious Jackson. Who else am I thinking of this here? You know what I mean? Like those type of bands like Veruca Salt. Oh, who else am I thinking of? Hetfield, what's her name? Juliana Hetfield. Stuff like that. I've been listening to a lot of that stuff recently. But anyways, nu metal did give the young man, the sensitive young man, in a decaying world in suburbia, an outlet. And Fred Durst, and this is why I think nu metal was so despised, but why they are loved by both Zoomers and a mature millennial audience, is that they denoted a time, a brief glimpse of sincerity and sincere emotions before the dawn of hipster irony, and also then later on the hip-hopification of all culture industry products, both in Hollywood, popular TV shows, soundtracks, and of course music. And pop music in particular, what is popular. And Fred Durst really is, I think, a figure of new sincerity. I think David Foster Wallace is looking down upon Fred Durst, and Fred Durst is saying, you watch the skies, I watch the ground. No, but it's true. Fred Durst is a new sincerity figure. And he's like, listen, he expresses his faith, his emotions, and yeah, a lot of this stuff later on was kind of cool. But you listen to songs, like I'm telling you, and a lot of it was because of Wes Borland being a good guitarist and knowing how to sound engineer. And a lot of it was the drumming of John Otto and the bass work and like just the whole thing, right? Of Limp Bizkit. Songs, of course, like My Way. And My Way, of course, bridges into the last topic I'll say about nu metal, which is something I think I wanted to write about, actually, which maybe I will. But yeah, songs like My Way, songs like, what's another I'm thinking of? My Way, songs like Rearranged, Let Me Down, and even more popular songs as well. But if you really look at the slower songs of Limp Bizkit, you can see the influences there. You could see a lot of the expressiveness of the music. And of course you have the more popular songs, like, Take a Look Around. Boiler's a great song as well. I remember being a kid and, seeing The Undertaker come out to roll when he was the American Badass. My Generation, of course, which I believe is the cover. Isn't it they were covering, or they did a tribute to the Who song? It contains references to the Who song, My Generation. That was, there was a moment there, and I think Limp Bizkit really expresses that moment in time of what it meant growing up as a millennial, what it meant growing up as a chud millennial, as a sensitive young man. The world would, like, listen, from the early 2000s to the mid 2000s, like, look at everything. It was the era of the chud. The world was open to you. Music, video games, pro wrestling was good, the Ruthless Aggression era, new metal, TV shows, everything was edgier and grittier. And they celebrated chud culture. And that was all erased. It was erased by the hipsters and by largely African-American culture infusing everything. And lastly, of course, My Way is a good bridge to the connection between pro wrestling and new metal. And of course, a lot of the indie wrestling, they did have a lot of things with alternative metal or alternative rock as well in the 2000s. But a lot of like deathmatch wrestling had music videos that fans made that had new metal songs or death metal songs. And there's this link between new metal and the early 2000s world of wrestling, because I think that a lot of the songs are about conflict and facing one's opponents and facing challenges and so forth. And especially the choruses have this upswing in a lot of new metal bands that are almost like, when you hear it, if you're a pro wrestling fan and you listen, like you go back in the day to like when those music videos were made that you could download off the LimeWire. A lot of them made it their way to YouTube, early YouTube. And they're, of course, granted, they were made like very grainy and low res, made from Windows Movie Maker or whatever. And you could hear the connection. A lot of new metal songs, it's like they're tailor-made for pro wrestling and that the culture around it. And of course, it's a great tragedy that the chud culture of both pro wrestling and new metal are being appropriated by certain soylenials and Redditors. And there's a sort of, especially with wrestling, there's this huge Redditification of it to where, certain members of the coalition of the contemporary political left, they really love pro wrestling for some reason. I know why, because of the performativity, the queerness, and so forth, and in the academic sense of the term. And so I understand, but I think that it's a great tragedy that certain things like metal, video games, even new metal, wrestling, that all of them that were coded with the largely blue collar or underclasses of the West, of the chuds, that they are then appropriated by the soylenial Redditor class. And I think it's a great tragedy. So anyways, I've been going on for quite a long time. I've yet to cover that article about burning of artworks from this gallery in Italy. Maybe I'll cover it in the paywalled version, or maybe next week, next free version of Content Minded. But in the paywall version, I'm going to cover the idea of the other third worldism, this Tucker interview, and my thoughts on it, and my observations of a lot of these things that have really, I think, have shaken up, and also shaped up the sort of current political moods among people in whatever you want to call it, the E-right, the dissident right. And I think my thoughts on this, of course, are nuanced because I have more of a sympathy towards, I guess you could say, a form of exoticism or perennialism, or, third worldism is becoming it is a pejorative, but I think that there is something to be said about it, both as a critique, but as something that is a trend among certain factions of the E-right. So hopefully you subscribe to my Patreon or my Substack, where you'll get the archive. And I really put a lot of effort into these. And next week I will probably release the interview with Mr. D. Oh, by the way, if you want a really good Limp Bizkit song, that's a sort of an obscure one. It'll Be Okay, I think, is one of the most sullen but yet meaningful Limp Bizkit songs that I quite enjoy. So It'll Be Okay. So please, to all of my pay piggies, I should be more harsh on people. I should be like Mystery Grove, where I'm like, the free subscribers, I hate you. But I can't do that. I don't have the heart for that. But please, support my work. This is what I do. I devote my life to content, to art, to analysis. Editing my book has been really a pain. And I love you all. God bless. Goodbye. See you over to the paywalled version. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast, where every Wednesday there are interesting guests, amazing ideas, solo streams, and discussions on a diverse array of topics from art, philosophy, history, and more. The free version will be available both here on YouTube and as a downloadable link on Anchor and Spotify, as well as on Substack. Each week, the full, uncensored, and spicier version will now be available on both Patreon and Substack, where you will have access to the full archive of both Content Minded and of Giant Reviews, where I break down interesting texts every week, including other exciting paywalled articles and good content. Thank you all. Please like, share, and subscribe. God bless. Goodbye. Help keep the content renaissance alive. Too sweet.